Good morning, everyone. Really appreciate you taking the time early this morning. Yeah, typically these things are during lunchtime and so on. But I really appreciate you joining us today for a wonderful seminar by Erwan Rambourg. Rambourg joins us from New York City, and so that's the reason we wanted to do it early. Yeah. I didn't want to disturb him at midnight when it's usually our time for the seminar. But anyway, so thank you so much for joining us. My name is Srini Reddy. I'm the professor at SMU, and I'm in charge of the Center for Marketing Excellence and the LVMH-SMU Luxury Brand Initiative. And so this is under the auspices of that we are providing the second luxury seminar for this academic year. So we had one earlier this month, and we'll have one more in November. So before I introduce everyone, I want to invite Mabel from LVMH. She has been a strong collaborator for us for the last 6+ years. So anyways, I want to give her an opportunity to introduce the collaboration between LVMH and SMU. Yeah, Mabel.
Thank you, Professor Reddy. A warm welcome to everyone, and thank you for joining the session. My name is Mabel Sin from the LVMH Learning and Development Team for Asia. LVMH Group comprises 75 exceptional houses that create high-quality products and experiences. It is the only group present in all 5 major sectors of the luxury market: wines and spirits, fashion and goods, watches and jewelry, perfumes and cosmetics, and selective retailing. And I'm sure the audience have their preferred or favorite brands. The LVMH-SMU Asia Luxury Brand Research Initiative was established in 2014 with the mission to develop thought leadership on building luxury brands in Asia. We believe in continuous learning to gain new perspectives, and today's webinar is one of which. We have managers from LVMH brands participating, as well as audiences invited through the SMU network. And we are delighted there is such keen interest in today's topic. I wish everyone a fruitful time of learning and engagement. Back to you, Professor Reddy.
Thank you so much, Mabel. A quick introduction of Erwan. Erwan has been here before, and at that time, he written an exciting book called The Bling Dynasty, and particularly relating to what's going on in China at that time. Looked like a lifetime ago. There are so many cycles that went on. We went through the COVID business. We're going through it right now. And I think he's chosen to write another wonderful book called the Lux, Future Lux, and what is ahead for the business of luxury. And it's so appropriate for him to come and join us today. Erwan has been in the luxury industry for a long time, and he worked for Richemont and LVMH, and then currently he is the head of retail, co-head of customer and retail research at HSBC, stationed in New York City. Formerly, when we met 6 years ago, he was there in Hong Kong, and now he's actually moved to New York City, and he lives there with his wife and 3 children. Okay, so without much ado, Erwan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Professor. It's an honor to be back 6 years later. Unfortunately, I can't be with you physically, but very happy to speak to SMU and to LVMH again. I think the first time I spoke for the first book was the beginning of your collaboration. So thank you, Professor. Thank you, Mabel. Thank you to the LVMH Group, and thank you also, Huling, for the organization. It seems that every time there's a crisis, I have this idea of publishing a book on luxury. So last time around, the crisis was really linked to the beginning of the administration of Xi Jinping in China, and this idea that you would be having a pretty swift anti-corruption campaign. And many observers of the luxury industry at the time were saying, okay, well, that's the end of Chinese luxury consumption as we know it. The future will be about Indonesian, Brazilian, Nigerian, Indian consumption. And the first book was there to say that's absolutely wrong. The future is still about Chinese luxury consumption. Obviously here, the publication of this book follows a much greater crisis, a much more global, in-depth, probably once in our lifetime crisis that no one can ignore, with a lot of ramifications. And again, you've had people thinking that luxury would suffer greatly. And again, maybe I'm too optimistic. Maybe I'm a sort of glass half full type of guy, but I believe that the sector for the next decade has great growth potential. And so essentially, the book is more holistic. It's more a helicopter view of the next decade in luxury post-COVID. So I have essentially, three different parts, but I just wanted to put this quote. If many of you probably do speak Mandarin, you know that this is not actually true per se, but the reality is that there's always this idea that you have many silver linings in a crisis. And again, I think the luxury sector, because you've had very good growth and very high margins and great cash generation, maybe there's been seeping into the sector a bit of complacency. So what I see with COVID-19 is the potential for a reboot, for a reset, to answer tough questions that have possibly been postponed and to move forward. So again, I think this is a great opportunity. I'll tell you about three things, and as Professor Srini mentioned, I will take a pause after each section to take some Q&A. But the first section is about the buyers. What will consumers become over the next 10 years? How will their profile evolve? The second part is about the sellers, so essentially the corporate world, the brands, the distribution partners. And the third part is basically to say, well, if the buyers change and the sellers change, well, maybe the definition of luxury needs to change itself. So starting with the buyers, the idea here is to try to explain in this part of the book, and again, I won't say too much on the book. I am hoping that some of you will read it eventually. But the idea is to say, if you look at the next 10 years, I see great potential for the industry to recruit at the base of this pyramid. Maybe some of you who have studied marketing know of the Maslow hierarchy of needs. So as a pun, I've called this the mass-luxe pyramid, which is basically, again, this idea of recruiting at the base of the pyramid and then eventually, hopefully, trading up. My optimism on luxury is in the capacity of the sector to recruit many more consumers over the next 10 years. And essentially three types of consumers, three cohorts of consumers. The first, which might sound a bit counterintuitive, is essentially the female consumer. I think there's a tendency in luxury to think that emerging clienteles might be very far from my home market. Whereas I believe that the emerging clientele likely is sitting next to you. I believe that we are on the cusp of seeing a great expansion in terms of spending by women. And it's essentially down to what Shinzo Abe in Japan called Womenomics. I think the reality of Womenomics is not a Japanese specific, it's a global phenomenon. It's basically this idea that if you look at salary gaps between men and women in the world, they are tending to reduce. If you look at participation rates in terms of employment, women are more and more active in the employment market. If you look at the fact that people are getting married later, if they're getting married at all, they're having kids later, if they're having kids at all. And so what that means is, as the age evolves on those matters, you will tend to be able to spend on yourself rather than spend on developing a household. So this is just an example for the US. Honestly, if you look at the data, whatever the market, their direction of travel is the same. I could have given you the age where you have a first kid, or I could have given you a chart on, again, the gap of salary. But basically, the sense of history is for women to have a greater place in society. And womenomics or economics or metrics actually go hand in hand with societal change. And again, here you might think I'm too optimistic, but sometimes crises actually deliver silver linings. So for example, the Me Too movement in the US was an eye-opener and enabled the society here to understand that there were massive issues. For example, COVID-19, if you look across the board globally, the 7 or 8 countries that have dealt with this issue the most efficiently happen to be run by female politicians. Surprise, surprise. So a combination of economics and of societal change will have women who, pre-COVID were already deciding for most of the household purchases to actually step up in terms of real spending. So when I say the future is female, immediately people say, well, in luxury, the past was female and the present is female. And I'm not debating that. I'm just saying that if you think about incremental spending, there is a wave of incremental spending coming over the next decade linked to these metrics. Now, obviously, this will favor female-driven purchases in female-driven subsectors. A very basic example is jewelry. You can think about cosmetics. You can think about handbags and accessories. Now, what's interesting on this jewelry chart is if you look at diamond jewelry sales, they've been up slightly over the past decade. But if you look at overall jewelry sales, they've been booming. What that tells you again is we're not in this sort of very old school traditional model where women are waiting for him to wake up and buy that 2-carat, diamond ring for you. No, that's not what's happening today. What's happening is self-purchasing. What's happening is impulse purchasing. I'm not relying on a male individual, a spouse, to wake up and finally, buy something for me. I'm taking my destiny in my hands. But if you look at other subsectors, again, intuitively it helps jewelry, it helps cosmetics, it helps handbags, but it helps every single subsector. And on purpose, I took the example of an entrepreneur, a startup company in the US, developing spirits by women for women. Now, honestly, it's for women, but I've sampled the product and it's really good. It's not limited to women. It's just countering this idea that in the spirits industry, there's a tendency in terms of communication, in terms of labeling, in terms of the overall perception that it's very male-driven, that it's macho in some instances. And I think this entrepreneur is very interesting because she is putting women back at the heart of spirits and making the case that to begin with, women invented the cocktail culture. And maybe it's less important in Asia and in Europe, but she is an American entrepreneur, and the cocktail culture obviously is huge in the US. So again, this female surge of spending is not limited to what you would think only as female-driven subsectors. So that's the first cohort. Again, ladies first. So I wanted to start with women, but again, I wanted to start with women because it's the most obvious emerging clientele, despite what most people think. The emerging clientele that everyone will look at, and which was the topic of my first book, is Asia, and notably Chinese consumers. And again, I was saying, my first book 6 years ago was making the case that sales to Chinese had only just begun. I still think we're at that stage of very early recruitment. You have the Brookings Institute, for example, explaining that the next billion consumers entering the middle class, of those, 88% will be Asian. And obviously, within that 88%, a great proportion of Chinese consumers. Now, if you work at LVMH, you've probably seen some charts like this explaining basically the boom in terms of your target markets. If I take the example of Vuitton, theoretically, Vuitton can target about 13, 15 million people in mainland China. That number will more than double on a 4-year view. So the idea is it's a phenomenal recruitment opportunity. Obviously, it's better if your brands can make people loyal and make them come back, but that's actually not the math right now. That's not the game. The game is really going after first-time purchasers rather than repeat purchasers. And what I would say in terms of change, it means that you will continue to recruit literally armies, if I can say, of new consumers, but with a fundamental change that COVID-19 has accelerated. This is a picture of Yunnan. I'm told it's a picture of Yunnan. I actually went to Yunnan when I was Hong Kong based 8 years ago, and no one was flying there, and it was very peaceful. I think if you ask your friends today in China, in Hong Kong or elsewhere, if they're planning to go to Yunnan, it's a bit of a struggle, right? So domestic tourism is booming. Repatriation of growth in mainland China started way before COVID. It started 2.5 years ago because you started to have price harmonization. You started to have the Chinese administration lowering VAT, making it easier basically to purchase, clamping down on daigou practices, notably. And so repatriation of growth started pre-COVID, but the reality is, under COVID conditions, no one can travel. So it forces a huge repatriation. A brand like Vuitton, a brand like Cartier was probably doing about 2/3 of his business with Chinese clienteles last year in 2019 outside of China. Now, no one's traveling, so everything is repatriated. So when you're seeing within your brands or other brands are telling you we're having triple-digit growth in China, it sounds counterintuitive, but it's just logic. If people are not traveling and they're buying at home, that's what happens. I believe even when the world reopens, you will have a continuous bigger weight, I should say, of mainland China for Chinese consumption than abroad. Many people have compared this to Japanese consumption. I think it's very different. I think the Chinese consumer is multifaceted. I think avenues to growth are very broad, and I think more importantly, when the world reopens, the passport penetration rate of Chinese is significantly lower than in Japan, than in Korea, than in the UK, than in France, than in the US. So, when the Japanese were the majority of luxury sales 20 years ago, in the initial phase, the vast majority was abroad, and pre-COVID, the vast majority was in Japan. I think the direction of travel will be similar in China, but it will be a lot more gradual because, again, the vast majority of Chinese wealthy individuals have not traveled yet. So again, give it a bit of time. Eventually, and again, this is a mix of all the brands that I look at. So you might be in 2025 already, or you might be in 2015 or 2010, but the direction of travel is the same. The aggregate of the companies that I look at had mainland Chinese accounting for about 38% of their sales last year. It should be half or more by 2025. When I show this chart, many people are scared, but you shouldn't be, because the reality is, Louis Vuitton in 2003 was 53% Japanese. And at the time, people were fearful that it had become a Japanese brand. It never became a Japanese brand. The reality is, if you are relevant with all nationalities, at a given time, you might be dependent on one nationality for more than half of your business. It doesn't mean you need to transform your DNA. I think Chinese consumers relate to cosmopolitan, traveled, sophisticated consumers abroad. You don't have to change your brand or your DNA to please the Chinese necessarily. The third cohort is essentially youth. And with youth, elements related to values, to inclusion, to diversity, to the environment, to questions. Why is it youth? It's essentially linked to this fact that luxury is essentially about human nature. And there is a tendency, once you become successful, once you have your first paycheck, to prove a point and to be welcomed in society and to prove that you're worthy of a relationship or potentially of a promotion. You are willing to impress your family members, your coworkers, your peers. And luxury is one of the most obvious ways to do this. So-called digital natives accounted for about 9% of the global population in 2016. They will account for 30% or more in 2030. And I would say, if you look at the two main markets for luxury today, and you look at the modal age, it's relatively low. So in China, it's 31 years of age. So the modal age is basically the age at which you have the highest proportion of population. In the US, it's 26. But again, if we think about the next 10 years and potentially the emergence of Nigeria, of India, of South Africa, for example, the modal age in India is 12. I'm not telling you that those people will buy luxury immediately, but if you have that 15-year view, clearly that will start to move the needle. And so I think it's very important to listen to what young people are asking for, because little questions today will become big questions tomorrow. And essentially what they're influencing is casualization, a certain chill attitude to the sector that obviously has been enhanced by COVID-19 because everyone's staying at home on Zooms like we are today, maybe watching yoga tutorials and not dressing up and not wearing a tie, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, digitalization. Digitalization doesn't mean you'll be selling everything online, far from it, but it means that if I'm spending 10 hours a day on my Samsung or my Apple, iPhone. Obviously, one of the ways I will become educated on brands is via blogs and forums and chats and WeChat and WhatsApp and the rest. And also, what's very important is values. So this is just one example of societal change in the US, but values are very important, whether it's linked to cultural sensitivities, whether it's linked to environmental, social governance issues, whether it's linked to climate change, whether it's linked to the respect of different nationalities and different cultures. Many brands have had pretty sizable missteps. For example, in China, brands like Dolce & Gabbana, for example. So I think it's important to understand what this young consumer is telling you, because 15 years ago, youth looked up to the older generation for cues and to understand about society. I think it's been flipped on its head now. I think people my age are actually looking to the, to people in their early 20s to understand where the world is going. So that's changed quite dramatically. So again, the combination of women, Chinese consumers, and youth will dramatically change the profile of growth of this industry in a good way. So I'll pause there, Professor, if that's okay, before I move to the second part to see if there are any questions on this one.
Yeah, there are plenty of questions, so I think I'll go in order. And so if let's say we don't answer all these questions, we can always defer it for the next segment. Yeah. So first question that we received was in terms of resource allocation. Again, this is a much more general marketing type of a question. In terms of how much resources would you actually allocate for acquisition versus retention in the luxury sector?
Yeah, so I think, again, in this initial phase of recruitment, that is probably still going to have to be the focus. I'll give you an example outside the LVMH group to keep it fair. Moncler last year did more than 70% of their sales with first-time purchasers globally. So imagine with Chinese, it was probably north of 90%. So again, it's great if the 27 or 28% of repeat purchasers are kept happy. But again, that's not where the bulk of the action is taking place. So I think it might seem a bit awkward to say that we're still in an initial phase of recruitment in luxury, because I've been working in the sector for 25 years. And so I would have thought that by now we would be more in a repeat purchase mode, but we're not. So I would say the idea is continue to focus on recruiting consumers, and hopefully consumers who can influence others to integrate that pyramid of luxury. It's great to have very loyal consumers. It's great to work on a local knowledge to really feed that more wealthy, more sophisticated consumer. I'm thinking about the very wealthy, sophisticated Hong Kongese Tai Tai, for example. She counts a lot. But in terms of incremental spending, I think we're still in a race to size right now. And that race to size means that a lot of your investments will be about developing awareness and developing means of bringing in more people in the pyramid.
Yeah, no, a great answer, Erwan. I know that it also depends on the industry being at various stages of growth. And in the initial stages, I think though luxury has been around, still in many of these countries, it's still in the early stages of growth. Acquisition is the key. You need to feed as much as possible, and then the retention comes in. Thank you so much. So here's an interesting question, and it sort of starts out with your first slide, which essentially says future is female. And so this questioner essentially has an issue with that, I think. Okay, so because the idea here is, so we're trying to break away from the stereotypes and the division of male and female dichotomies and so on. So how do you address that? I mean, I think your point is slightly different than what I sense from this question, but I think there is this issue that I think this person brings out. Yeah, how do we sort of the increasing tendency for gender politics and the dichotomies and stereotypes? How would you address this issue for luxury sort of companies? Yeah.
No, so I think you have a lot of subsectors where gender neutrality or gender fluidity, or however you want to call it, i.e. this idea that it doesn't really matter, the gender doesn't really matter, you are addressing a need and it could be quite holistic. So if you think about certain products of the bigger brands like Hermès, or certain skincare products, for example, or certain models, if you think about, for example, more like the athletic footwear part. So, a lot of brands like Moncler, Gucci, Vuitton, Dior, developing sneakers, whether it's collaborating with Nike or Adidas or whoever. And this is very gender neutral. But what I was pointing to is more the economic reality that female citizens are actually going to have more financial means to spend. So it's more about my spending power as a citizen than about the products. The products can actually go a gender neutral way, if you will, because it's true that a very nice collaboration on so I'll take the example of Pradidas, which is basically Prada with Adidas. Honestly, anyone can wear it. Kids can wear it, moms can wear it, dads can wear it, youngsters can wear it. The gender is completely irrelevant. But what I would say is, again, if you think about where we are at today in terms of spending and what the next 10 years will deliver, I'm placing myself from the citizen and the consumer and his or her means. Her means will accelerate much faster than his means. That's what I meant to say. Yeah. No, the product can be gender neutral, can be gender fluid, can be adapted to anyone, potentially. Yeah. No.
Very good. Yeah. One last question, I think, which is a very practical one that I think seeking your advice, and then we move on to the second segment, Erwan. Yeah. He says, what advice can you provide us for our store managers during these tough times?
So that's actually a good segue into the second part, because I'm going to talk about stores. What I will say is consider nothing's a given. Consider that you will be rewarded to be a risk taker, because I think consumers reward brands that take risks. We do see it with the success of Vuitton today, with the success of Dior. I think, there's so much to choose from in this industry that I think you have to accept that change is good. You have to embrace change. You have to be willing to take risks, because at the end of the day, if your view of being a sales associate is, standing up behind the counter and hoping that that client will come, that's finished, right? So I think it's about learning how to connect, learning how to interact, learning how to welcome, learning how to speak differently to different people. We're not machines. Consumers don't want machines. Consumers want, luxury is tending to be more and more the illusion of scarcity. There is no real scarcity unless you're Patek or, parts of Hermès or, but Vuitton will never tell you we've run out of cows to produce leather. Yeah, there is no scarcity, but you have to give this illusion of scarcity. You have to give this illusion to the consumer that she's the only one, that what you're providing in terms of product, in terms of content, in terms of service is pretty unique. So be creative, take risks, and you'll make mistakes, but it's better to make mistakes and to learn from them than to think that the world's going to come back to normal. It's not.
Excellent. I think that, so we'll stop for the questions for the moment. I keep making notes so that we will come back to some of the questions we've not been able to answer in this segment in the next one. Yeah.
Okay. Excellent.
So, yeah. Continue.
Thank you, sir. So as I said, 3 cohorts that will drive growth: women, Chinese, and youth. And now I'll move on to the sellers, so the actual companies and the distribution models. And what I would say is, sadly, for many small independent companies, we are in a world where in the past 10 years, scale mattered a bit, and now we're in a world where scale is everything, and where you have vast advantages, so VAST, to be part of a big group. So it's fortunate that I'm presenting to LVMH today, or to be part of a big brand. And the reason for that is, again, because we are in a sector which is a recruitment sector, The idea is for you to speak with a louder voice than anyone. So let's imagine you are in a very crowded space, like in the handbag category, for example. And you are a small independent brand and you are the number 47 in terms of market share. You're not going to make it. You know, it doesn't mean you're going to go bust, but you will never be relevant because you won't have the means to compete. Because if I'm in the market of my first branded handbag, I will go to the big guys first. Why? Because I'm not buying for me. I'm buying for others to recognize that I've been successful. So I will be influenced by the brands that are dominating the airwaves, basically the top three, you know, Vuitton, Chanel, and Gucci. And if it's not the top three, if I'm wealthier, it might be Hermes. If I'm edgier, it might be Dior, or it might be Prada, let's say. But outside of 6 or 10 brands, it's going to be a lot more difficult unless you have something that really is very specific to your brand. You need a voice. You need the backup of a group to develop that voice. Scale also gives you authority. What I mean by authority is that you want to be in the driver's seat. You don't want to be a passenger. You don't want to be a victim. So in terms of authority, it could be, for example, your relationship with shopping malls. You know, if you are part of LVMH, Richemont, Kering, and you're a smaller brand, you might find that you'll get some help by being part of a bigger structure because you have the means to negotiate. You have the upper hand relative to distribution partners. If you're a small independent company, again, unless you're super creative, it's going to be tough. Synergies exist as well. What I mean by synergies is, not necessarily getting lower, rents or not necessarily getting lower fees in terms of media rates, for example, but it's also synergies in the sense of if you're part of a, let's take LVMH, 75 brand group, and you have one brand doing something exceptionally well, whether it's CRM, whether it's online, whether it's testing with a multi-brand platform that no one else within the group has tested, there are synergies in the sense that, whether you're making mistakes or whether you're making inroads and progress, people can be inspired and you can help other parts of the group. And then, as you all know, HR departments always like to talk about people first. I didn't do it on purpose to put talent last. It was just to spell vast. But the reality is the bigger groups and the bigger brands will attract the better talents. So if you're the number 2 at Prada, unless the CEO disappears, it's going to be pretty tough. If you're the number 2 within a brand within LVMH and you do a good job, hopefully you'll be the CEO of another brand eventually. You have the capacity to give a pretty meaningful and motivational career path. Now, linked to scale, all of these advantages, linked to scale is the reality that M&A, is a means to actually increase that scale significantly. So I won't talk about LVMH Tiffany here unless you force me to. But what I'm thinking is after 10 years of quite a bit of M&A activity, I think the next 6 months will be pretty quiet because the bigger groups need to negotiate leases, need to take care of their staff, need to maybe rethink CRM, digital strategy, and they might have other fish to fry than to add another layer of complexity and fixed costs. More importantly, you need to bear in mind that this is a seller's market. I keep on getting questions along the lines of, why has LVMH not bought Chanel? That's not the right question. The right question is Chanel a seller? And the right answer is no. So it's not going to happen. It's a seller's market. Deals only happen when sellers are ready to sell. And in the current environment post-COVID, your first half as an independent small player has been terrible. Your sales have gone down dramatically. You've probably lost money. You're not looking good. So that's why I think there'll be a pause over the next 6-9 months. But when in 2021 you will see a visible rebound, then I think you'll see an acceleration of M&A. So again, pretty sad for small independents, this sort of Darwinism, if you will, of the luxury sector. But the reality is big guys will get bigger. So one of the projections in my book is, LVMH has 75 brands today. At the end of this decade, should have between 90 and 100, if not more. And again, it's shouldn't sound surprising. You know, LVMH started with 3 assets, LV and MH, and ramped up to 75. It's just the nature of the business. You know, there is no tendency from family-controlled companies to buy back shares, to give back special dividends. If you accumulate cash in your family, you want to spread your risk. You want to develop other assets. And so that's a natural thing to do. And it's not just LVMH. You know, Kering will likely be quite active, Richemont, et cetera, et cetera. Now, moving on from what the corporates might do and looking a bit at distribution, there's a whole section, actually a whole chapter in the book called Brick and Mortar is Immortal. And it's a bit of a counterintuitive approach to say that if you are a premium European luxury brand, there will be a cap to how much you can sell online. Obviously, if 100% of your stores are closed, which was the case in certain parts of the world in March, April, June, you don't have a choice, you'll be selling online. But if you look at this industry, and again, if you consider that the bulk of growth is to first-time purchasers, remember there is this buzzword in the industry, which is storytelling, which is basically the storytelling between the brand and the consumer. I think the more important storytelling is amongst consumers. And if your storytelling of my first branded handbag purchase is I was online for about 10 minutes, I clicked twice, and then I received my handbag for 24 hours later, it's dull. There is no story. It's beyond boring. So I think there will be a place for stores that will be the most important place. If you're Nike and you're selling shoes at 60 or 80 bucks, and Nike tells you that eventually half of their business will be online, I trust them, because I know that I'm a medium or I'm a size 10 in shoes, and I know Nike, and it's only 80 bucks. I'm not taking a big risk, and I can return it. So I will order online. If I'm buying cosmetics, and I have a lipstick which costs, $25 or $30, and I've tried it on. I went to Sephora or I went to the brand, and I tried it on and I like it. Do I need to, cross half the city to go to the store? No. So there will be business models where online can be dominant. But if you are, again, a premium European luxury brand, and you tell me that half of your sales are online, there's a problem. Either you're jeopardizing your brand equity, or you're actually not premium. You're probably more affordable. And I would just point to the example of so-called DNVBs, digitally native vertical brands. These are business models that were created online. And I think when they were created, they probably thought they would stay online forever. And the reality is they understood pretty quickly that they needed to develop a very intimate emotional relationship with consumers. They needed to have a physical presence to exchange. They needed to have differentiated stores. Now, if the stores remain dominant in luxury, the stores in 10 years or even in 3 years will have nothing to do with the stores that we've known in luxury for the past 20. I think fundamentally, this idea that you can have an impression of déjà vu, as the Americans would say. So this idea that if I'm walking into a store, I get the illusion that I've been there before, that's a complete no-no. That was, the very old school approach in China. In China 10, 15 years ago, I would open a flagship in Shanghai. If it did well, I would open 40 or 50 others, and I would do like a copy and paste, like a cookie cutter approach. That is not what the consumer wants. What the consumer wants, to give you an example, is maybe what you find today in Tokyo. Again, if you're working for the Vuitton brand and the footprint of Vuitton in Tokyo, there's not a single store that looks like another Vuitton store. Even in Japan, even with the Osaka project, which is completely different. So it's this idea that the store needs to be a third place, not your home, not your office, but a place where you mingle, whether it's LinkedIn if you want to be serious, or whether it's more like a Facebook or something that's a bit more social and fun. It needs to be a place for education. It needs to be a place for entertainment. It needs to be one store has specific artwork, has specific product assortment, has a specific layout, is again giving you the illusion of being unique, the illusion of scarcity. So again, I'm not pretending to tell you that stores will be dominant and they'll be the same as you've seen today. They will be dominant, I think, but they'll be very different from what you're seeing today. So I'll shut up for a minute to take any questions on that part.
Very good, yeah. we're running closer to the deadline, so I just want to make sure that we finish up.
Sure.
Couple of interesting questions, I think, in this round. One question, I think, I mean, the framing of this question is, the questioner said duality of Paris and New York. I mean, this is where much of the luxury sort of brand emanates. And the counter is that we are actually setting up headquarters in Singapore and Hong Kong, and not doing that inside China. So, and the question is why we're not doing it. I mean, is it because if you actually establish even a greater presence with headquarters set up in China, would the consumers think that it's actually not, it's a domestic brand, not a luxury brand from Paris and New York and so on. Anyway, so it's an interesting question whether with the increasing growth in China, should luxury brands go set up major operations in China, and what kind of downside effects it might have?
I think that's a great question, and I think it will happen more quickly than what you think. The reason I think it's been so slow is, for having experienced it myself as an expat in Hong Kong, or I imagine with people who work in the industry in Singapore, you have great living conditions for expats and for families. And there is probably this fear that if you relocate to mainland China, your life won't be the same. That poses a lot of questions. First of all, do you need expats to run businesses? Mm-hmm. Not necessarily. And secondly, is the role of Singapore or Hong Kong bound to be central? I certainly don't think so. I think the repatriation of growth you saw in mainland China, again, was given a boost by COVID-19, but that was certainly the direction of travel it was taking. All of the businesses today are booming in mainland China, artificially because of, or thanks to COVID. But again, when the world reopens, China will still be the main market, and the market that you have to understand, because whether she's buying locally or traveling, you need to have that proximity to consumer insights. So honestly, I think conversations are going on as we speak, likely within the LVMH group as well. If you're having heads of Asia or heads of Greater China, if they put it that way, who are Hong Kong based or who are Singapore based, clearly conversations will accelerate in terms of, you know what, we need someone in Shanghai. So I think that's bound to happen. And it's not happening because you will give the illusion that you're a Chinese brand. No, you have very strong headquarters in New York. You have very strong headquarters today, mostly in Hong Kong. But I think the role of, up until actually the CEO of LVMH, Bernard Arnault, 6-7 months ago made the comment that Hong Kong always rebounds. I think now you're hearing people within LVMH, within Richemont, within Prada, within other brands saying, yeah, Hong Kong might come back, but it will never be at the level that we had at the peaks, because even when the borders reopen, Chinese have other options and repatriation of growth continues. So Hong Kong will remain a very important hub, but it won't be the luxury mecca that China, mainland China, is starting to become. So I would imagine that if I'm not an HR specialist, but I would imagine that headquarters HR and Asian HRs are working on how and when they will put the center of power in mainland China.
Yeah, one quick question and a response, because that might set up the next segment in your talk, Erwan. This question relates to one of the participants mentioned the Nike model, where they do a lot of stuff online, the omni-channel model that they have, but the online, they present exclusive models, exclusive equipment or shoes or garments. So the speculative question here is, would that be a luxury model for the future?
So I think part of the success of, again, to focus on LVMH, part of the success of Vuitton over the past 7-8 years, with the new CEO and the new organization, has been hyper-segmentation. Has been this capacity to please every consumer subtype without alienating any. You can please the uber wealthy individual who's been shopping at Vuitton for 20 years, who spends hundreds of thousands of dollars in an afternoon in a VIP salon, sipping the champagne that she prefers with the sales associate that she prefers. And at the same time, that store can welcome a middle-class young 22-year-old who's buying and who's in and out in 2 minutes with a list of things she needs to bring back. So to your question, I think hyper-segmentation of product offering, hyper-segmentation of distribution. So again, trade marketing, what do I give to Foot Locker versus the Finish Line versus what I carry on my sneakers app if I'm Nike, just to take that example you're asking about. That is very, very, very relevant for luxury. Yes, hyper-segmenting your offer, being very close. I think that the big advantage again of COVID-19 is you've had a sort of forced localization. You have to, if you're running France today, there are no tourists. You better have a keen interest in what the French think and how she's looking at your brand and what makes her move. So knowledge is power. Get as close as you can to that consumer, and give her something that's again very specific. Yeah.
Excellent, Erwan. Yeah. So again, just to caution the audience as well as Erwan, we have 15 more minutes, Erwan.
Yeah.
So
I'll make the third part super quick.
And then we can field more questions that way, before you wrap up at 10:30. Okay, continue.
Absolutely. So very, very quickly on the third part, the idea is, let's imagine we're towards the end of the 2020s, and let's imagine that we are moving from a recruitment business to a repeat purchase business. That's when you have the risk of substitutes to luxury starting to emerge. What I mean by substitutes is subsectors that will take from your share of wallet. And essentially, the role of some of the bigger groups like LVMH is probably to try to capture as much of your share of wallet outside of consumer electronics, right? But basically, outside of Apple or Samsung, what can I creep into? So I'm just going to go through a few potential substitutes. One substitute is affordable luxury. Okay, if you think that the middle class is about to boom, maybe you should have brands in affordable luxury positionings. Now, it doesn't always work, unfortunately. I'm giving you here the example of leather goods. If you look at Michael Kors or Coach, they have very limited growth, even though they're catering to middle-class consumers. I think the reason for that is Gucci, Vuitton, Prada, Dior have been very good at redeveloping access price points. And so the idea is, if I can afford Coach or Michael Kors today or Vuitton in 4 months, I'll wait 4 months, because the return on that investment in terms of being accepted by my peers will be worth more than 3 or 4 times the price that I'm paying. So affordable luxury, I think, has a great future in ready-to-wear, in jewelry, but certainly not, in my view, in leather goods. So that's one potential substitute. Another substitute that we saw really come into focus during the COVID-19 crisis is basically health and wellness, and this idea that health is the new wealth. And if you're based in France, you have great social security, you don't really have an issue. If you contract the disease, you're probably thinking that you'll be taken care of by the administration. But if you live in the US, it's a different story. And if you're not well covered by your employer, then you might be in trouble. So I think there's a consciousness of how important health has become. And I talk in the book about the trinity of health. So these 3 images: exercising, eating well, and sleeping. Most people forget the sleeping part in that trinity. And people like to brag about the fact that they sleep 4 hours a night, and either because they're going out or they're overworked. I think it's terrible. The reality is, if you don't have all 3, you're not actually living a healthy life. But so the focus on sporting goods products, the focus on wellness products, the focus on meditation. You have meditation apps in the US that sell at crazy prices because they use stars. They use Matthew McConaughey, they use John McEnroe to help you go to sleep, which sounds completely ridiculous, but the reality is people are ready to pay up for that. So these are potential substitutes, and I don't think that's going away. The fact that I need to live a healthy life in a healthy body, in a healthy mind, that's very important for many wealthy consumers. Another substitute is what I've called the premiumization of everything. So it's basically this idea that around you, there are subsectors, pretty much any subsector can have a very premium version. So this is the example of Starbucks roasteries. The Starbucks around the corner cost $4 or $5. Starbucks roasteries, I can spend quite a multiple of that to, again, have a story to tell to people around me. It can be virtual reality. If I can't go on a trip, if God forbid there's another pandemic in 10 years, maybe I will pay for a Vuitton or some other brand related to travel to help me escape the realities, and I'll be ready to actually spend money on that. Potentially cannabis. Now, again, this might sound completely crazy to you, but if you go to Colorado or if you go to Los Angeles, you have high streets where luxury is competing against cannabis. They're competing for staff, they're competing for locations, they're competing for your wallet. Do you need that second, third, fourth handbag, or would you rather have a an experience in terms of a cannabis-infused cocktail or other experiences that are far more crazy that are happening in California these days? Another substitute, which today might seem completely off because the world is closed, is essentially travel. Now, a lot of you have probably read this news around flights to nowhere. Qantas in Australia basically charging you to board a flight from Sydney and to land in Sydney and to basically do the rounds for 7 hours in the air. If consumers are crazy enough to do that, it really tells you that there is appetite to travel again. And whether there's a vaccine or whether we learn how to live with this pandemic, I think the world will gradually reopen and people will be willing to spend a lot on travel. Now, this is actually quite telling if you work for LVMH, because if you remember the last two acquisitions of LVMH, one is Belmont, which is a hotel chain, hospitality chain, and the other is Rimowa, which is basically a high-end suitcase company. Now, it's easy today, post-COVID-19, to say, the timing of those acquisitions were terrible. The reality is, again, if you are working at the strategy level, or if you're in the mind of Bernard Arnault, your mission is probably to get a sense of what will people want to spend on in 10 years? Will they want a third handbag? Will they want a second watch? Or will they want an incredible experience going to a hotel or going to a Michelin star restaurant that no one has heard about and bragging about it? So this is a big substitute for me in terms of share of wallet. Obviously not today. Nothing is happening from a travel perspective much these days. The last section of the book is basically to say that there is a need for values. There is a need for luxury to fulfill its mission of defining the cultural zeitgeist. There is an obligation for luxury to understand who they're selling to. It's easy for me to say today, when I used to work at Richemont, nothing against Richemont, but I didn't know who my consumers were. I didn't need to know. I needed to know, can I produce enough? I didn't really know who I was selling to. Today, it's a tougher market. Today, it's a more competitive market. You need to know who you're selling to, and you need to know what that consumer values. And oftentimes, she will be asking questions. She will be vocal. Not everyone is young and angry like this young lady is. She is very vocal. You might say she's not a minority, but everyone knows what she's saying. And so you will have a minority of consumers asking you questions about how have you produced, how have you manufactured this handbag or this diamond or this watch? What happens to it? Once I wear it, what's in it for the planet? More and more publications and books around the fact that the fashion industry, ready-to-wear industry, is the most polluted on the planet. So there will be a lot of questions which the luxury industry hasn't even started to really address around circularity, around the afterlife of my product. You're not in a world anymore where you should think along the lines of take the money and run. It's not just about the P&L. It's about values. It's about understanding the society. It's about giving back to communities. And we saw a lot of brands and a lot of groups, of which LVMH, taking a lot of initiatives in terms of PR during the COVID crisis to say, we're repurposing our production sites to produce hand sanitizers, to produce PPE. We're giving to charity. We're financing the building of hospitals. You might ask, that's not the role of luxury. Yes, it is. It's the same thing that happened a year and a half ago when Notre Dame, came down in flames in Paris, and LVMH and Kering immediately gave hundreds of millions of euros. And I got questions from American investors saying, why on earth are they financing the rebuilding of a church? And that was my response. It's about the cultural zeitgeist. It's about understanding the society that you live in, understanding the consumers that you're selling to. Some will bury their heads in the sand, some will see the light, some will take this opportunity of this crisis to reset, to reinvent themselves. And I know, Professor, that I've spoken too much, so I'll try to shut up now. And I just wanted to thank you, SMU, and to thank LVMH as well for this opportunity. I was told that I needed to put this little device here for you to give feedback, but I'll leave it to you now if you have more questions. Yeah. Thank you so much.
We do have, the audience has questions. I'll try and see. There are plenty of questions. I don't know if we can take all of them in the next 5 minutes, but I've actually sort of written down some of the things which I think picks up on what you've already said. One of the questions is in terms of the wines and spirits. I think one of the questions that asked about what are the other kinds of models, evolution of the luxury goods into other sectors. And you had actually a dramatic example of how brands are now looking at hotels and experiences and even hemp. The question here is on particularly on premium wines and spirits. Mm-hmm. Do you see this led by women and Chinese consumers? And the contrast to that is, as we're emphasizing health as well, how does it actually sort of really conflict with the health issues and the risk to the spirit brands? I know I have a selfish question for you as well. I recently completed a case of a Chinese brand called Mutai. Yeah, I don't know if you remember. I mean, this is now the largest market cap luxury spirits company in the world. Okay, mm-hmm. Bar none. And it's actually a phenomenon in terms of that I traced in this case. And I'd like to hear a little bit about it in terms of, I don't think that we discuss the health issues there as much, but I think here what the questioner essentially is saying, maybe the women's segment is probably not considered as much in the spirits sector, though I think you did mention an example there, and the Chinese consumers, but also the contrast with the health issues that crop up when you're trying to promote wines and spirits.
Yeah, so I think on spirits, obviously health issues are tricky, right? So, but you've had a tendency from the premium operators, whether it's LVMH, Rémy, Pernod, Diageo, to promote drink less, drink better, and to try to move away from binge drinking and to try to move away from attitudes which are obviously impacting negatively society. And there are some sad realities. For example, right now in the US, it's good for the business of spirits, but for bad reasons. Because people are drinking their way out of COVID. That's what I'm hearing a lot in the US, and that's not necessarily a good thing. The role of if you look at, you have to then segment it basically. Category by category. Cognac in the US is very much driven by men, very much driven by minority, the Hispanic community, the African American community. Tastes will change, and women will be a lot more influential on the wine part and more delicate things than hard spirits. But again, as I said, you do have a cocktail culture which gradually is being more and more influenced by female tastes. On your question about Chinese consumers moving the needle, again, it really depends on the category. I believe if you look at cognac, clearly that's been the case. If you look at other spirits, I think the fact that Baijiu is dominant in mainland China means that beyond basically Scotch and cognac, Western spirits are not getting a lot of airwaves and a lot of space. So you're really down to brown spirits because there's this association of this has been matured. This is a product that has 20, 30 years of age. There's a history, which to a certain extent reminds you of the history of other parts of luxury brands in watchmaking, in jewelry, in handbags. Champagne is very interesting because champagne is not successful that much with Chinese consumers. I had an explanation from Pernod, and I had a similar explanation from people at LVMH telling me that Chinese consumers find it odd that a wine would sparkle. Now, and honestly, many people in the champagne business were bullish about the Chinese market 10 years ago. They still are, but things haven't moved dramatically. Champagne remains a Franco-British, Belgian, American drink, essentially. So again, it varies category by category. I think fine wine has a phenomenal future because again, if you look at the idea of buy less, buy better, and a bespoke experience, there's nothing more specific than, wine is infinite in terms of diversity, in terms of provenance, in terms of vintages. And I think you can spend your life basically studying wine and still continue to discover things 40 years later. So I think there's a great potential. The difficulty for a group like LVMH to invest in wine is it's incredibly fragmented. How many little producers are you going to accumulate, and will it actually move the needle for your group? And the answer oftentimes is not really. The type of volumes you can get for cognac, the type of volumes you can get for champagne are tremendous. The type of volumes you can get for fine wine, not your $4 bottle, but fine wine, that's not the game. So that's more intricate, that's more difficult, that's more driven by also the art auction business, et cetera, et cetera. So that's almost a different world. Baijiu, or Maotai, as you were asking, that's a very, again, talking about specific tastes and specific cultures, it's phenomenal in China. I still think it's, it's a display of success. It's a display of, welcome to my world and of welcoming. I don't think there's a lot of potential outside of the Chinese market. Do you need it to have potential outside the Chinese market? Probably not. There's probably still enough growth to be had in mainland China before you start to think about a cap to growth. So I've always been fascinated. As I said, I was based in Hong Kong for 6 years. And every time I went to China, which was several times a quarter, I would obviously go to banquets and go to meetings and drink a lot of the stuff. And I can't say I was a phenomenal fan, but it's a fascinating, very specific cultural luxury. And again, I think the companies in that premium space have proven the point that it's not going to go around. It's not going to go out of fashion anytime soon.
Yeah, but the question is, will it go outside China? Because it still is like 90% of the sales are still in China, and the remaining is probably for Chinese expats around.
Well, that's the thing. Yeah. If you think about the diaspora of Chinese clienteles in Canada, on the West Coast in the US, in Australia, in Singapore, and other places, yes. But with non-Chinese consumers, I think, I think it goes beyond let's say the time frame of my book.
Fantastic. Yeah. Anyway, so Erwan, we're right on time. My apologies to all the participants who have actually sent in fantastic questions. We could handle most of them, but there are a few that I think we can cover, and due to the expiration of time. So again, my sincere thanks to Erwan for taking the time late at night, to come to us and then actually spend this hour essentially sharing great insights into luxury. And I think you're always, what we notice is incredibly timely. I mean, so I think this is a fantastic book to have and a fantastic discussion that you had with us today. Okay, so.
Thank you, sir. I just wanted to reiterate my thanks to you for moderating this. My thanks to the people at LVMH, as well as Huiling for organizing this. I wanted also to mention that because I speak too much, if there are questions that I have not answered, please feel free to contact me.
Yeah, so that's the thing. I'll say goodbye, Erwan. Yeah, and
thanks for having me.
And all the LVMH group and our SMU guys. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Cheers.
Yeah.